Hello and welcome back. I am Sarah Meyer. I'm a health sciences librarian at the University of Florida. Thank you for joining our discussion panel, Learning Across Disciplines, Approaches to Develop Reproducibility Education for Undergraduate and Graduate Education. Today's undergraduate and graduate students are tomorrow's early career researchers. As students explore new knowledge, integration of reproducibility training and education promotes and instills long-term reproducible best research practices. Our panelists today are from a diverse range of academic disciplines. They will share their experiences and learning approaches to facilitate research, reproducibility, training, and education for undergraduate and graduate students. Please feel free to interact with our panelists by placing your questions into the Q&A box. And so to get us started, I thought we would just go ahead and have everybody give a brief introduction of yourself and then also talk about your area of research reproducibility education. And just based on my screen, if we can go ahead and start with Brian Avery.
Hi, thanks. My name is Brian Avery. I used to, actually for 18 years, I was a professor at a small undergraduate institution in Utah called Westminster College, where I taught science, genetics, neuroscience, biology. And in the last 4 years, I've actually also been an undergraduate student and a graduate student. And now I work as a biostatistician at Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. So I kind of have a sort of a different perspective, having taught a bunch of these sort of issues, but now also dealing with them on a day-to-day basis, working with big data and genomics and transcriptomics and things like that. But in no way am I an expert on how this stuff gets done, right? I think like lots of people that come to reproducibility, it comes much more from this, kind of what we heard about this morning from Brian Nosek, this sort of idealistic point of view, like, hey, this is the way it should be done. Why isn't it being done this way? And it just turns out that you get into it and you realize there are ways you can contribute. And it was nice to be able to do that as an undergraduate professor. And to now see the other end of it and kind of also work through it as a graduate student. So hopefully some of that perspective can be helpful today.
Thank you so much. And Jared Millman.
Hello, I'm Jared, and basically I'm currently a biostatistics grad student, but my background and the reason why I got into this is much more from two aspects. So I was for years sort of research computing staff at the Neuroscience Institute at Berkeley, and did a lot of work with neuroimaging researchers and faculty, doing a lot of one-on-one, helping them write code and develop scripts and design analysis. I've also got a background in scientific, open source scientific Python. So a lot of my ideas about how things should be done are really from that community. And I have a much more of a sort of a bottom-up approach, I think, than the top-down. So I've thought a lot less about institutional rewards and funding agency issues and more about training at the undergraduate and graduate level, which is appropriate for this forum. And I've taught a few courses at Berkeley in the statistics department, and they've all been around reproducibility and computational analysis. But in one particular course, which is listed in my bio, and has a paper I wrote up about the course, is a course called Computational and Reproducible Statistical Data Science. And in that course at Berkeley, we have a 15-week semester, roughly, maybe 16 weeks. So it's a fairly long period of time. And the course that I taught was very much a hands-on versus theory. It was almost from the beginning of the class, the students were required to choose a data set with a published paper online in neuroimaging. And then they had to form groups and figure out what they wanted to do in terms of analyzing that data or exploring the paper. And then it was very much a just-in-time sort of lecture series where, some of my co-teachers and I, had a couple of people helping me, would meet weekly and figure out where they were in the projects, what kind of questions we've been getting on GitHub and things like that, and then try to figure out what lessons they needed for that. So there's a lot of flipped course as well. We gave them a lot of materials they had to pick up on their own. The other thing was it's a very interdisciplinary course at its core. So it was in the statistics department, but we basically had on every team, there was about 4 to 6 people, and almost every team there was someone from statistics, someone from computer science, someone more algorithmic end, and then someone with more domain knowledge, not necessarily biology, but more of a scientist. We really organized it around the core competencies of Unix command line and text editor, version control with Git, high-level readable programming languages using Python, although I think R is a great language as well, and Julia, and there's many other languages that I like. Emphasizing structured code where procedural programming was the dominant style, so building functions, really discouraging class object-oriented programming, and more. There's a lot of nice ways to program, but I think functional programming is very nice for, or procedural programming with functions is a very nice way for scientists to analyze code. Also, code review is a very important part of it. So we use GitHub and all the code review mechanisms there. I'm just gonna have much time. And then testing, so writing tests for all your code, unit testing, and then also integrating some of the continuous automation, CI, continuous integration stuff that are available for free on GitHub, and that many of the open source projects use quite often. And then the students were basically at the upper level undergrad, or master students, or first or second year grad students, which I think is a very nice period to get people at. Maybe this idealism has still not been beaten out of them yet, but also, at that age, they're very quick to pick up new skills, and they don't have a whole pile of backlogged research to do. But I think this could be very much introduced at the high school level or younger, scaled back version. And sort of the real reason that I focused it around a project was that, to me, I think a lot of these issues about reproducibility and data management are very abstract and hard to understand when you have like a small data file that you can just look at, and or a CSV file, or you have a script that you've written over a week. You can just remember what you did. But it really sort of becomes complicated when you've got a month-long or 2-month-long project to remember all the details of what happened initially, even for your own project. And I think you can't really do reproducibility unless you yourself can reproduce your work. And this was much more focused on the computational programmatic reproducibility, in large part because I had already required them to take statistical training for these courses. So, they should have already been introduced to some of the statistical issues. And hopefully that, as they did this, the scientific reproducibility issue would become apparent just because they were looking at previous work and trying to figure out if they could figure out how to do some of these steps of analysis. But I do think reproducibility is, it's very important to have all the aspects involved.
Thank you. That is already starting to bring up some questions that we'll get to here in just a second. I do want to let everyone else introduce themselves. Matthew Gurka, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody. I'm Matt Gurka. I am a professor here at the University of Florida in the College of Medicine in the Department of Health Outcomes and Biomedical Informatics. I'm a biostatistician too, and an armchair epidemiologist. I've been I've done a lot of collaborations in my previous institutions at the University of Virginia and then West Virginia University, and now here at the University of Florida, primarily in pediatrics, working with a lot of clinical scientists. And I've served as a statistical mentor to a number of these clinical faculty over the years. And my experience with reproducibility training started a couple of years ago as the NIH really started putting more of a focus on rigor and reproducibility in all of their grants, and especially in the training grants, in the career development grants, and pretty much expecting some sort of training component for all those applicants who are, applying for these training, these Ks and T grants, either, the individual awards or the institutional training awards. I led the efforts here at the University of Florida to develop a course for that audience. So it's primarily, it's actually a bit beyond undergrad and grad. It's more post-grad. It's, it's clinical faculty. They're, they're full-time MDs or PhDs already doing their own research. They're interested in pursuing NIH training grant of some sort. And this is a way to supplement their training and be able to say they've done something during their career development in the space of rigor and reproducibility. So we wanted to do something that was beyond just a series of online modules, something that was more engaging and interactive for this audience, but also recognizing that they have full-time jobs and this might not be their primary interest. So I've spent a lot of time in my career focusing, teaching, the concept of statistical literacy. I'm not teaching biostatisticians per se, but I'm teaching, them to be appreciative of, good statistical principles. I really see this course that we developed. It's a 1-credit online course offered in the summer to provide them that general appreciation and best practices. And it's just as much focused on rigor and rigorous practices as it is on reproducibility. We've offered it 2 years now, and the first year was sort of a pilot year to get off the ground. This last summer, we had 37 students, which is good, and it's because it's online. It's offered here at UF, but it's also offered through distance learning, so we really want it to be available to anybody outside of UF as well. The major components of it being, as you can imagine, we talk obviously the general motivation, why is there such a focus on rigor and reproducibility, which is a huge component of it. We talk about selecting, the key biological variables and best practices with respect to data documentation, data dictionaries. We spend a lot of time in study design. A lot of these folks are going to be designing clinical trials and all the aspects of designing a rigorous clinical trial and all the all the documentation needed to make it reproducible. And then we do talk about best analytic practices and transparency and reporting. It's a concise 6-week 1-credit class to provide them that general introduction as well as resources to dig deeper if they're interested. And really, beyond that appreciation, in the spirit of team science, I've been on dozens of grants in my career and serving on study sections for NIH. This is to get this future group of PIs the appreciation of building an appropriate team of biostatisticians and data scientists to supplement their team, to provide them those resources to ensure that their research is reproducible moving forward, and they can appreciate that and be, participate in those conversations and make sure that they provide the resources and know the time and infrastructure it takes to do that properly. I think that's pretty. I think that'll summarize what I'm doing here at UF.
Thank you. And Rachel Hayes-Harb.
Hi there, thanks. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm Rachel Hayes-Harb. I'm a professor of linguistics and the director of the Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of Utah. And I think a focus on researchers at the earliest stages in their careers, and in this case, I'm going to talk about undergraduate students, is worth our attention and our investment for at least 2 reasons. The first is probably the obvious one. We address the culture problem in science by embedding research skills and sensibilities development within the responsible conduct of research and open science values and practices from the very beginning, right? And in doing so, we ensure that reproducibility is always a part of how students think about research. But the second comes from my experience in directing programming for undergraduate student researchers on my campus. So we find that culture change regarding things like research mentoring quality has been powerfully enhanced by preparing students to expect high quality mentoring. And so, like Jared just mentioned, this bottom-up approach can be similarly effective in addressing the culture problem in science, with our undergraduate students driving some of the change in the direction of open science by modeling the behaviors of open science and also questioning problematic practices. So we know why this is good for us in general, but why is it specifically good for students? Well, I think replication research is a great way to train undergraduate students in a number of ways. And in my experience, they can be wildly successful in certain kinds of replication research and at least report to me that they enjoy the experience. So it's a direct and fast route to impactful research questions and methods, right? So instead of spending the years it takes to develop deep knowledge of a literature, students can get directly to the hands-on components of research while they're in parallel developing the crucial skills and knowledge, deep knowledge of the literature. It can also be done at scale in many disciplines because the methods and analyses are preset. It allows for some hands-on and exciting learning experiences for students. And, you know, as as a person living in a society, I like the idea that since we can do it at some scale, we're promoting public trust and productive skepticism in science among college graduates. So I'll tell you just a little bit about a course I've been teaching in my department. It's the capstone course required for the linguistics major. We have approximately 20 students a semester. I've done it 2 semesters, 2 years in a row. This fall, we did it, of course, online via Canvas. I selected a study by Donald Rubin in 1992 on reverse linguistic stereotyping. And we were actually lucky enough to have Rubin and a collaborator give a virtual colloquium to the students this semester. The course is taught in 4 phases. We begin with responsible conduct of research, open science, human participants, research, data management, and social justice. And then we move into several weeks of skills development. So students learn how to consume literature. They learn to do what we call article dissection. And crucially, we develop collaboration skills by creating collaboration accountability rubrics, how to set expectations, how to have difficult conversations with collaborators. Then we develop some of those technical skills. In this case, it was Qualtrics because we were going to do an online implementation. They learned some HTML coding that was necessary for customizing things to do the replication study. And finally, quantitative analysis skills. They learned to navigate things in Excel, develop figures. And because inferential statistics training is not part of our curriculum, we had a very small section on descriptive versus inferential stats. Then, of course, we went on to piloting, data collection and analysis, and then dissemination. And indeed, just this week, our students are going to be giving their poster presentations at our virtual research symposium and submitting final papers.
Oh, it's fascinating. You all bring such interesting different backgrounds into this. So let's see, we have a first question from the audience, and that is that the comment was, it's nice to have some neuroscientists here. And what do you think about regent reproducibility, specifically RRIDs for antibodies, cell lines, and organisms? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I'm at least a recovering lab nerd. I mean, it's a huge issue, right? If you publish a protocol, you publish data, it has this, it has a cell line or an antibody in it, and it's not the same if someone else gets the same reagent, supposedly the same reagent. It's like all the same issue. We as researchers need to just expect that people will put these things in there, we'll publish them. We need manufacturers to do as much quality control as possible and publish those results. And then we need journals and funders to expect that all this stuff will be in there so that you can actually reproduce an experiment. And without that, we're pretty much stuck in the same place. But I think, starting it ourselves is something that's already come up several times, right? Like doing it ourselves first and then kind of building that expectation that that's how everyone will do it is super important from my perspective.
Absolutely. Any other comments from the panel on that? Okay. So we have another question coming in. What resources or suggestions do you have for supporting students who express concerns about how their labs report or conduct research?
Yeah, I'll say something.
Thank you.
Maybe not exactly answering the question directly, but I do think that the issue is really important, that when you're going to figure out what lab you're working in, that making sure that you have a really strong sense of their ethical and sort of principles is really important. And I think it can be difficult because, it can be very difficult to get through grad school quickly, but you want to almost as soon as you arrive, start thinking about that. I think it's also really healthy for grad students to talk to each other about what their experiences are, and then really think about, not your faculties, just how prestigious they are and what, likelihood you are to get into prestigious journals, but to think about how well you fit in with the culture. I do think that if you have a problem after you're already in it, it can be very difficult. And I have been fortunate not to have that problem, but I've seen other students have it. And It's just a really difficult problem. I think, the damage that senior PIs can do that are unethical to junior researchers is pretty severe. And, I guess the one thing you can do is make sure that if you're already in a situation where you can't get out, maybe keep your head down, try to get out, and then make sure that you do not, do that kind of stuff when you become a PI, if you become a PI, I guess.
Well, I would just say it's important for students to know what their options are when it comes to addressing these issues. So, for example, while there are procedures in place to handle violations of responsible conduct of research at universities, it's often not the first way a student wants to go, right? For really obvious reasons. But equipping them with the knowledge, validating their experiences, can actually go a long ways towards helping the students to figure out what solution is the right one for them. But also having a place on your campus where students feel safe going when they have these issues, I think is absolutely crucial, because the power, of course, within the lab they're in, as Jared just mentioned, are super tricky. But having a place where students can go. So at our university, we have an office for undergraduate research. Students can come to us and we help them navigate it. I'm not going to say we always solve it to everyone's satisfaction. These issues are incredibly complicated, but they do need a safe place to go at a minimum.
Yeah, that's to add up to Rachel's point, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think equipping the students, knowing who to go to and where they could go on their campus to express these concerns in whatever way they feel comfortable. I see Mary Ellen in the chat mentioned, the students knowing about the Ombuds office. That's a great resource to have those confidential conversations and to provide that advice on where to move forward. A lot of universities have some sort of office of research integrity and not only that, but tools to anonymously, to inform, to provide that information if they feel comfortable doing that. So I think knowing those resources is helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And that navigation and those resources are so critical. Thank you. So we have a number of other questions coming in from the audience. So one of those is, what do you think are the competencies that translate across disciplines that students need to learn in this area?
I mean, I'll guess that that's a long list, right?
Yeah, we could just start with everyone and see what we come up with.
I'll throw my support behind the very not sexy data cleaning as a way to, like from the perspective of everybody's going to have data, everyone's going to have messy data. No one wants to do that. 80% of their effort of munging through all the stuff and figuring out where the the data dictionary is and what does that column really mean, and just those sort of like kind of traditionally under taught skills are really important. And also probably reporting is the other big one on the other end, is like making a report that people can actually look at, that's interesting, that has the information that sort of the consumer of that analysis will want. Those are sort of two things I'd throw down.
Yeah, I'd add, in my mind, I think everyone should learn. I mean, just because computational research is so prevalent these days, that I think it's really, an early researcher should learn, R or Python probably to some, facility. And version control with Git, I think, is increasingly crucial. And I think, once you use Git and start using GitHub, I think it's really nice to start looking at code review. I think one of the reasons why we have such atrocious code is that people really view this as like something they almost want to hide, instead of a communication mechanism, which code should be. So I think once you start having code review, it forces you to have that mindset that you're having a conversation with someone else who could be just yourself, but and also, having code review gets you into the mindset of like how code can be written better or cleaned up, or where errors can happen, and you can learn a lot from one another. And it also takes coding from a very solitary effort to something that's more social. And I think people like that. I do. So it helps you spend more time on it.
Yes, thank you. Those are excellent. Anyone else have anything they want to add to our list? No? Okay, so I've got some more questions for us. Top of our list is, how do you get your university-wide culture to encourage rigor and research reproducibility? Anyone want to add something to that?
Well, isn't that the question? I think
Right.
we've heard a lot of ideas already today, and I'm assuming over the next day for ways to embed expectations about research reproducibility into things like RPT and just general ways that universities work. But I really do believe, I guess I want to emphasize this again. I really do believe that universities are at our core are our students. And to the extent our students are prepared to demand that we act in scientifically open and socially just ways, we're going to respond. And so I think that remembering that the students are the core of what we do at a university is a good way, right, for us to think about where to invest when we're trying to figure out how to make that change in this bottom up fashion.
I'd really like to second that one. I also think that we just need to do it everywhere, right? I think we all make these assumptions as educators that, oh, students will take that one research methods class and they'll get it, right? They'll get their ethics and their this and their that, and we just sort of rubber stamp it and we forget about it, or we just sort of treat it as a done deal given that they've fulfilled that requirement. Same thing with statistics. Oh, they took a stats class, so what do I have to do that for? But we really need to integrate it. Like every project a student does, every time they put numbers in anything, it should be reproducible. They should be able to hand you primary data, code, whatever it is, and you should be able to reproduce that data. Everywhere from like high school stats through undergrad. And then, you have classes like what Rachel talked about that were these capstone experiences that are really sort of project driven, and give the students the expectation. I mean, this is such a good idea that they would just have a reproducible analysis, that's what everyone does. I'll tell you, I've had students be really frankly disappointed that they'll pick up a research paper and they'll be like, oh, we think this paper is great, and we read it and we want to talk about doing something like this, so we're going to reproduce their figure 2 as our sort of like starting point, and they can't do it, right? And it's not their fault. Like, they're totally capable, but the materials are not there, the methods are not there. They're mad. Like they turn to you and they say, why is this okay? And sort of having those conversations as well to really sort of integrate it and then see how it gets specialized and how it gets used in their field are two really sort of important ways to go about it.
Do we have any other comments on that area? Oh, yes, sorry.
I'll talk just from the flip side of things, from the top down, trying to convince university admin too about the importance of this. And I saw another Q&A about trying to convince PIs if you're in a lab on how to incorporate these sorts of best practices. I think inherently, university administration, they're risk averse. They're averse to legal action. They don't want publicity, bad publicity. So I think convincing either admin or your PIs, implementing these practices or encouraging proper training in these practices will lead to less retractions of papers. And I think any PI of any lab will like to hear that. And those sorts of messages are good. I think my experience, as I've communicated with our class, a lot of this is top down from funding agencies too. They're expecting it. So, how we can convey that and how can we incorporate that at the university levels is important too. I completely agree with Rachel and Brian. I think that, inherently, this at its core, we need, thinking about students in a bottom-up approach. But there are, ways to capture the top-down opportunities there too.
Thank you for everyone sharing their thoughts there. So our next question comes, do any of your courses or workshops address managing, changing lab culture when when you are a student or a postdoc? As Matthew just mentioned, often students are on board, but their PIs are resistant to these new practices. Does anybody have any thoughts about I know that Rachel talked a lot about addressing that issue of learning to communicate difficult topics.
In my role as director of our university's Office of Undergraduate Research, I think the way I would think about this is it's going to be a slow process, but gradually students are not going to want to work with PIs who are not doing things in an open science way. And so I don't think it happens, overnight, but I think students know what they want and know what they expect, and mentors have reputations for various reasons, right? They can be a huge name and draw people who may or may not agree with the way the lab works, independent of, right, and choose that independent of those reasons. But basically, students expect good mentoring, right, when they know they can. Students expect good science when they know they can. And so I very much appreciate Matthew's point, though, about this is not just a bottom-up process. This is certainly a top-down one as well. But I think meeting in the middle there is the way to make institutional change.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I was going to say also, just to give a, I often find myself when I look forward very frustrated, thinking that I'm still fighting the same kind of fights I've been fighting forever. But then occasionally, if I look backwards and think, really, really hard about what's changed, things have changed. It seems slow going forward, but I mean, the fact that this conference existed, 20 years ago, there wouldn't have been. At Berkeley, there's courses that have reproducible research in the title of the course. That would have never happened 20 years ago. I think, I also have the sense that younger students come in knowing a little about these issues, and the idea of programming being a much more central role in science, I think, has gained a lot more prevalence. And then for the top down, I think it's the same thing where, you're starting to see more and more funding agencies ask for things. You're seeing more and more journals starting to think about things. More and more campus level kind of decision makers are thinking about these things. So I think, being frustrated is good because it keeps us moving forward and pushing, but you shouldn't get too despaired, because I think that things have changed quite dramatically, but we should still push.
I think whoever made that comment, asked that question, is a genius and should make that workshop happen, because I think it's a fantastic idea, and I've never heard of anything like that. Exactly that kind of thing existing, and it just sounds perfect. So I say to whoever you are, go for it.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you. While we're on this topic a little bit, so sort of a sidebar question that I have is, as early adopters in research reproducibility education and training, what has been the response of your in your departments and your colleagues to your development in this area? Are you noticing, like Jared is saying, that it's becoming more accepted, or still uphill battle?
So I'd like to tie this to another question that's out there, which is adding something new means taking something out. And I want to acknowledge that spending time on research ethics does mean we don't do other content. If we, on the other hand, decide that it's the most important thing we do, then I think the negotiation of what falls out of the bottom of our list is a different kind of question, right? So in terms of the department, I think that at least my department, I think it took some time to understand why I would focus on this as opposed to some more content in my field. But I've been able to kind of sneak it in a course that has allowed a whole bunch of flexibility. And I think that showing over time the results of this work actually makes it easier for us to make the case that it's something that does need to be embedded, right? So you can sneak it in the curriculum and then make the case after the fact. So I'd advocate the sneaky route.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. So we have another question that's got a number of votes here, and it's for @Jared or others. Do you have any recommended tutorials or resources that you like for Get Learning and code review best practices?
I've written some stuff that I'm not sure I would totally recommend, but I did think they were fine. But more of a general approach to teaching Git. I think, at least the way when I teach Git, is that really the issue is there's a sort of syntax part of Git, which can be very opaque, and I don't think maybe some of the commands aren't really great. But then there's a sort of what's actually happening to this working tree directed graph structure. And so when I teach that, often I will have assignments where I show the graph structure and ask them to write up the pseudo commands, or I'll give the commands and ask them to write the graphs. And I think, at least in my mind, really having a good sense of that. If I know what's going on to the graph, then I can Google or look up the commands or rediscover the commands. But where if I just learn a recipe of the commands, I often get confused about what's actually happening, or at least when I started, I've mastered it now. But so I think I would really structure the thinking around the structure of how Git works, which I think is the really beautiful part of Git. And the commands, they're not great, but they're not so bad when you know what's happening. For code review, it's difficult, I think, to sort of train that other than doing it. So I think it takes both watching code review, and then when I do the courses, one of the things I do is I have the students do code review against each other, but I also have myself and the TAs come in and do code review. And so it's a lot more of a modeling behavior. And in general, the course I taught was more of that style of what it would be like ideally, I think, in a lab setting to be mentored to do a research project, and less like a traditional materially taught course. Code review, I think, also requires being very nice to one another. It's very easy, I think, in this code review to feel like you're being attacked or insulted, and that kind of shuts down everything and makes people less likely to share when the goal is to share and communicate. So I think code of conduct maybe would help, which is not really training, but at least establishing ground rules about how you respect and behave around one another.
Absolutely, thank you. And Brian,
as far as the Git stuff goes, github.com has a really good just set of materials that are really accessible. So if you're like, hey, what is this? And I want to even look at how it works. GitHub has a lot of training materials for both command line Git, but also you can use their web interface, and that can help people get started. I think the understanding how it really works under the hood is super important, but sometimes you just need a lightweight sort of excuse to get going, and that helps too. If I could backtrack just the last one too,
yes.
about sorry. I think having, the question was about colleagues and departments and things, and I found a ton of support from just talking to colleagues and saying like, hey, have you heard about this thing? Like, I'm thinking about doing this. And people just sort of came out and said, oh yeah, I think, I've been working on that or thinking about it, and trying to bring it out of these isolated spots. I mean, it turns out there's someone in the psych department at Westminster that I used to teach at that was super into it. And I had no idea that he was into thinking about reproducibility. And we got together and did a lot of stuff. And it was really a big part of our stats, intro stats program too. Everything was done in our Markdown, and everything was sort of thought through as this reproducible reporting kind of framework. And so just sort of bringing it up and sort of finding those sort of soft spots where you can sort of get hooked up with other people that are thinking similarly. And then all of a sudden, maybe it's a big deal, and people in departments kind of have to deal with it because you're already doing it, and they didn't even know you're doing it. So back to Rachel's sneaky argument, you just sort of do it, and you don't ask permission, and you kind of later you're like, yeah, you didn't know. I mean, this is important stuff. Like, of course we're doing it.
I'm just ahead of it.
Gets you far. Yeah, we're ahead of it. So
right.
get on the train.
That was excellent. Thank you. Rachel, we do have a specific question for you. So the question is, what does your linguistics scholarship contribute to research ethics? I ask because I teach writing, and in our RCR program, we have a component on writing, and I'm interested in what you do.
Okay, so I think I have a couple possible interpretations of this question, and maybe you'll clarify. So the linguistics work I do is could be otherwise called behavioral science. So we do human subjects research, quantitative experimental work. So that calls up maybe the expected issues around human subjects involvement, data management, analysis, things like that. In the context of writing, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities in writing to think about the RCR issues of authorship, of mentorship for anyone developing in any area of expertise. And then also in, I might be thinking about this at a different level than you, but I'm wondering if thinking about writing isn't a great place for us to talk about reproducibility and communicating the things that have been done very clearly. It seems like that's a place where we need to think a lot, right? How do we make our work more reproducible through the act of writing?
Mm-hmm.
I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, I'll let you know if we get any follow-up on that. We have a couple other questions. Let's see. So we have, can you comment on protection of graduate students against a fallout of research misconduct proceedings? Yes, that one is difficult. Many layers of it. So we also have, and we've been talking a lot about this, but how to garner support from our senior stakeholders. And this one is specifically in the development of data management capacity. So infrastructure, resources across domains, everything from conversations to collaborations, I think is what they're interested in hearing about here. Anybody have any comments on that? Okay, well, I would like to ask a question, and that would be, what would be your one wish to change in the research ecosystem that would help to facilitate reproducibility? If you had a magic wand. Better understanding?
This will be shocking to you, but I think that embedding all research institutions need to embed research ethics education in each program of study. It needs to be part of the curriculum, not an add-on, not extra co-curricular, but it needs to be part of the curriculum. And I think that because to the extent that any student is going to be involved in any research enterprise as a student, they need to know how to do these things, right? They have all this power as agents of change within the institution. If they set expectations and the faculty, all the mentors respond. But also, again, we want one of our obligations is to send people out into the world who have a healthy skepticism about science and a good understanding of how good science is done. And so I think that if I had a magic wand, every department, every major would instantly embed RCR into their curriculum as a required component.
If I had a magic wand, I'm going to go fairly provocative here. Have universities consider this in promotion and tenure expectations.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this era where there's so much pressure to publish and publish fast and publish a lot, I think this leads to bad research. And I think if there could be, and again, this is a magic wand, I'm not expecting it, but if expectations could be a little bit lower, not quantity, but quality. And recognizing all the things we've talked about, all the things we try to educate our students on with respect to, like Brian mentioned, documentation, all that takes time, and you want to do that carefully, methodically. And so that would be something I would like to see.
I would definitely say equal value for negative results. And that would take care of so much, right? If you could get funding to do something that, if you had a career in science where every result was negative, why isn't that equally valued to people who are considered so successful now because everything they've ever done has worked out? I mean, these are stories we make up in retrospect, right? To make everything, all the the results all look like they were all thought that way in forward time, but it's all in reverse time. So I think if we could wave that magic wand, I would put those two things on equal footing, and then they get published and be funded, and then, you know, quality would just be there.
Absolutely. Any other comments on that? So I'm curious, as we're talking about that, does anyone on the panel's institution have a research reproducibility training or education requirement for graduation? No, doesn't sound like it. So we do have another question here, and that is, do you think that reproducibility RCR training should be interdisciplinary, or is it too specific by discipline?
I mean, I think building on some of the other comments where they talked about it being an integral part of your entire course, I think yes and no. So I think early on, it's really important to have interdisciplinary groups that get the basic foundations all the same. And I think it also benefits from building a better community by dealing with one another and understanding the different specialized issues. But then I think later on, there'll probably much more specialized training, you know, and then like my mind, ideally would have, the model would be not that the specialized courses would be focused on reproducible research, but they would be focused on the domain, and the reproducible research would just be like a core part of that work, and building on the tools that you learned in a much more interdisciplinary environment.
I think reproducibility as a value is domain general, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way it's manifested ends up being different, but that seems to be connected to specific skill sets, right? So that are associated with a discipline. So if you're, it seems like, I love Jared's thought of having some amount that is interdisciplinary, right? And in large groups, having conversations, working through these things. But then obviously there are going to be ways in which, you know, there's conventions within fields. There are customs with respect to authorship and authorship order, right? All of these issues actually end up looking different depending on the discipline. So I think both.
Yes, absolutely. And that is bringing up another interesting question that we're getting from the audience, Rachel, and they're asking, can we talk about what is unique in each of your own fields that students might need to learn that would help them to address reproducibility?
I mean, this is a fairly vague general discussion, but you know, in neuroimaging at least, you know, in MRI, there's image registration, co-registration parts that are very specific to like how you register two brains from two different imaging modalities. And you know, that really is important because if you're collecting functional data from one modality of imaging and anatomical from another, if you don't sync them up correctly, you're going to get activation in different areas of the brain. But then again, in general, like the type of computational tools you would need to do some of that work would be much more generic. So I think, you know, it, again, would be just natural part of specialization. Each domain is going to have a very specific set of, you know, kinds of parameters that are going to be important to look at, types of analysis that are going to be important. But some of the generic problems, like, you know, the difference between confirmatory or exploratory research is something that, you know, you can get at a basic level. Using version control, something everyone can get at a basic level. You know, maybe doing hashing of data sets would be something everyone could do. But then as you get much more specific into your data analysis, I think it really would become dependent on the domain a bit. But I do also think there's a very natural trajectory for moving in that direction. And a lot of this, you know, basic stuff, you know, some basic introduction optimization, some basic introduction to linear algebra, some basic introduction to, you know, some basic signal processing and statistics are all things that I think you can do very hands-on without getting a lot of the detailed math. Something I was going to mention earlier about how you get this kind of stuff in without taking stuff out. So I think, you know, for example, in statistics, and I'm not sure how it's done now, but psychology at Berkeley and I think other departments had been set up to do t-test where you were doing it on pencil and paper. And so a lot of the training was like, you know, how you make, you know, the columns and lines so that you don't make mistakes when you're adding up numbers and multiplying. And also traditionally in statistics that, you know, there's been a lot about these limiting distributions, but now that we have computational power, you know, doing resampling methods, I think is a much more simple and easy to understand and gives people a lot more intuitive knowledge. So I think you can restructure some of the existing courses to be focused more on the computational tools in such a way that you get both of them without losing too much. I mean, you will have to lose some, but I guess also mention with what Rachel said, or I think it was Rachel, maybe it was another speaker. In one of their courses, they spend time thinking about how to learn to learn. So I think in part of these computational research, reproducibility issues, you're really training people about how to build and do things themselves. So I think that training that kind of stuff and giving people good tools to keep continuing learning, I think is probably going to be necessary.
Anyone have anything else to share there? It does seem like an overarching theme there is critical thinking, that would be very important across disciplines for everyone. So another question that we have had come up is that high school has been mentioned several times, and I think that's just in context that we have talked about the idea that the earlier we can get to this training, the better. And as a good audience to teach about these concepts, are there any thoughts from the panel about what academia might do to reach out to high school students? Yeah, I would just say that I would think a number of opportunities there for possibly mentoring, and I know a lot of the panelists are involved in that, and that would be one way for us to reach out to high school and let them know that we were available to talk about those types of things. So thank you for that question. We
I think
also,
if I could just throw in one more
yes,
thing
of
too,
course.
that sharing your materials. So
Yes.
if you teach intro stats and you have a lot of stuff on reproducibility in there, sharing them openly on the internet, and then also maybe if there are data science meetups in your area, or if there are ways that you can sort of get involved in a community that does those things, or even reaching out to high school students or high school teachers that might teach something like AP stats or a statistics class, that kind of thing could be helpful probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great. We have another question. Lab Archives recently announced Jupyter Notebook integration feature. What are your perspectives on the use of electronic research notebooks for reproducibility? Any comments on that one?
Go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say, so I tend to not be a huge proponent of Jupyter notebooks for reproducibility. I think they're a great way to disseminate. I think that it can be very dangerous just because of that sort of nonlinear structure to like have people doing weird sets of clicks. But I do think it's a nice mechanism for sharing results and letting people look at them. So I think it's more, in my mind, it's more, I would use it more at the exploratory phase where I'm trying to figure something out, and then at the dissemination phase, and then in the middle, I would think more about scripts and libraries. So I really haven't fully thought this out, but I think it is partly that it's a new type of way of expressing yourself. And I was trained very much that like the way I read, I like to start at the top left and go to the right and then down the next line, where notebooks can make that a little confusing. But I think people really like them, so I think it is something that the developers are thinking about how to improve some of those aspects. It also has a problem where version control is not great, or at least the last time I looked at it, and so that makes it really hard to edit them, I think, in a way that's systematic. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I do think in terms of having as a front end for dissemination, I think it's kind of straightforwardly good.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can be really good for some things for sure. They're really intuitive, especially after the fact when you're reading, like Jared said, dissemination. I think electronic lab notebooks can be really useful for keeping track of the data collection, and having used that kind of thing in both teaching and in research. But I mean, it's all only as good as what goes into it, right? And so you need to be able to train students how to use lab notebooks and how to use Jupyter notebooks and how to not get sort of things all tied in knots. And but I mean, that's what educators do, right? You don't just point a student at a tool and say, this will solve all your problems. You have to scaffold it for them, help them use it, give them feedback on how they use it and things like that. And so I think having consistent tool sets is helpful. And that's one thing in, if your whole science department, for example, uses lab archives as research notebooks, or for class lab notebooks and research notebooks, it can be really helpful. Same thing with Jupyter notebooks, or like a R Markdown or an R notebook. If you get people on board and multiple people are using it, then students get more out of it because they get more familiar with the technology. So it can be helpful from that kind of integration point of view.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one?
Can I make
yes, please.
Actually, it's more of a question. It's going back to the high school question.
Yes.
I can't see now who asked that question, but I would be really interested in hearing the sorts of things they're thinking, and if they know. So universities have various ways that they integrate with the high schools in their areas, and it's a really interesting idea to think about introducing RCR at the high school level. So I'd be interested in hearing from that person if they have more thoughts on that.
Yes, please do put in any other thoughts you have for us about that. That's a very interesting idea. And then we have another question that's coming up, and that is, any recommendations for finding the best resources? Search time is obviously limited. There's a lot of resources. Do we have any areas that anything people would recommend in particular? I know it can be difficult to find things, and sometimes, like Brian was saying, we want to share our information. Do we have any areas we think be best for that, or places that you're comfortable when you go to look for materials?
If you're looking for training for yourself or other people, the data carpentry and software carpentry have a lot of both coding, and also usually they have reproducibility modules, and they have some of the same ideas in different kind of from different field perspectives. So there'll be like an ecology version of that and a genomics version of that, and so that's one place that I often find helpful and can often send people to find resources.
And this might be a chicken and the egg kind of problem, but I also think, there's tons of resources out there, but I think what I've always found the most useful is having a community of friends and colleagues that support this idea. So I think, it's great to go out and read material on your own, but having a group, even a small group of people that you can discuss these things with. And I would encourage you, I think one of the earlier talks I had gone to had mentioned reproducibility with spelled like a drink. I don't know anything about it, but that kind of thing might be a way to get a community if you don't already have a group of people in your department or in your school. And I think, again, what I think about the code review part is, really having a conversation about what you're doing with other people, showing what you're doing and having them comment on it and think about it, makes it much more engaging for me. And I think it's also the way I learn best. But I also say that data carpentry, I think, are pretty good, and the place to get boot camp on your own. And they also have the community built in too, which is you can become an instructor, and you can offer the courses at your university if you're not familiar with them, which is also a good way of, if there's not a community at your university of grad students or undergrads, to sort of identify some people that could be a part of that community.
Yes, excellent suggestions. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any closing thoughts that they want to share before our panel ends? Well, thank you all so much for, Rachel, thank you.
I just wanted to say, in response to that question, the idea of a community of people who share ideas with respect to education and RCR and reproducibility is a great idea, and something that could very nicely come out of this conference.
Yes, very, very nicely. Thank you so much. That's a great suggestion. Thank you for joining our panel.